In this video, we're going to go over two cases of people who disappeared in the remote wilderness. But strangely, each of these people was skilled and experienced enough for this not to have happened, and yet it did anyway. Sometimes, these things just happen deep in the woods. As always, viewer discretion is advised. As you might imagine, a ton of research and writing goes into creating videos for the channel, and I want to share a tool with you that I've started using to help with productivity called Opera. Not only is Opera one of the faster, safer, and smarter browsers out there, but it's packed full of useful features for privacy, security, and my personal favorite, productivity. Let me show you how. First and foremost is their integrated AI chat, Aria. I actually use AI chats a ton to help with research, finding topics, and basically everything else these days. Having it directly integrated into a browser though is a game changer. Let's say I'm researching a story and I stumble on a word or a topic I don't know. In Opera, I can just highlight the word and then ask Aria to explain it briefly or explore it in depth. Or like other AI chats, I can just open up Aria and talk about something completely random. And for staying organized, Opera has a new tab island feature. I'm sure you all know how one tab can quickly turn into a dozen and then you have no idea which is which and everything is cluttered. With Opera, tabs are grouped intuitively to form a tab island. This allows you to keep similar tasks grouped or collapsed when you're not working on a task but don't want to necessarily close the tabs. Opera also has built-in extensions for messaging and music apps like WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, and Spotify. This means you never have to open up a tab or a separate application to use them. On top of all of that, Opera has a free built-in VPN, allowing you to browse more of the internet more securely. And the best part about this is that it's completely free. This means that you get an AI chat, a VPN, and everything else, stuff that would normally require a monthly subscription, totally free. This would be a good deal even if it costs money. So I highly recommend you check out Opera for free using the link in the description below, and a huge thank you to Opera for sponsoring this video. On September 14th, 2004, 49-year-old Bart Schlayer sat in the passenger seat of a float plane taking in the vast remote Yukon all around him. In a few minutes, the plane would touch down in the water of Reed Lakes and drop him off to begin a 2-week moose hunting expedition. For some people, this might be extreme, but Bart lived for these types of trips, and almost nothing made him happier than being in the wilderness all alone. When Bart and his pilot had all of his supplies off the plane, they shook hands and confirmed the pickup day and time, and then the plane took off again and disappeared into the distance. Once the plane was out of earshot, the silence was almost like nowhere else on Earth. The Yukon and much of northern Canada is a type of untamed wilderness that's really hard to overstate. About 80% of it is basically completely untouched, undeveloped, and without people. Not only are towns few and far in between, but there are hardly even any roads. It's basically just a vast expanse of trees and mountains. This means that if something were to happen, in many cases, there's literally no one around to help. It's not just one thing that makes it so inhospitable either. Much of the territory has a subarctic climate and high elevations. This means that summers are short, winters are long and harsh, and the terrain is dangerous year-round. Incredibly though, that was exactly what Bart was looking for. He planned his entire life around spending large chunks of time on hunting trips just like this. Where he was dropped off is about 200 miles northwest of the capital of Whitehorse and just east of the Alaskan border. And this is an area that's remote, even within the Yukon. The closest sign of any civilization at all is just a single gas station about 15 miles away. Otherwise, it's surrounded by snow-capped mountains and thick forests populated by moose, elk, and bears, which is exactly what he was looking for. 2 weeks later, on September 30th, the sound of a plane engine grew louder until the plane once again glided across the surface of Reed Lakes. Then the plane turned toward the bank where Bart was dropped off, but there was no sign of him. The pilot waited for a while, but Bart didn't turn up, so he got out and walked around the area a bit. Then he shouted for Bart for a while, but there was still no response. So after waiting a little while longer, he fired up the engine and took off, and when he landed, he officially reported Bart missing. Shortly afterward, the RCMP sent a search team to Reed Lakes, and pretty quickly they found bins full of food and leftovers from a meal that must have belonged to Bart. Further down the lake, his inflatable boat was found tied to the bank, but this was just a preliminary search, so the RCMP left shortly after to come up with a more detailed plan. Understandably, Bart's family and friends were not happy about this, because if he were hurt or anything else, he might not have much time left. So instead of waiting around, 2 of Bart's friends flew up to Reed Lakes to conduct their own search. And pretty quickly, the 2 men found Bart's collapsed tent near his gear and supplies, which immediately raised concern. In the area where Bart's boat was found, they also discovered his bow, arrows, and a handmade quiver. Next to those items was a bag of gear that had an impression in it like someone had used it as a seat. What they found next, though, caused them to fly out immediately to contact the RCMP. On the ground was a camouflage mask that belonged to Bart, and on it there was hair and blood. When a new search team returned a few days later, the RCMP found some more of Bart's stuff in the same area, and from there it was only a matter of time before a portion of a human skull and several bones were found. Using dental records, the skull was later confirmed as belonging to Bart. Almost immediately, the RCMP suggested that he was the unfortunate victim of a bear attack. There are thousands of grizzlies and even more black bears in the Yukon, so it was reasonable to assume he might have been unlucky enough to have had an encounter. The only problem with this is that Bart wasn't just any hunter. If there was anyone that wouldn't have been killed by a bear, it was him. Although he chose to live a relatively simple existence, Bart was actually an accomplished scientist in his field, which just so happened to be wildlife biology. He fell in love with animals at an early age because his father was an avid hunter and would bring him on hunts as soon as he could remain quiet enough for long enough. Once a friend introduced Bart to bow hunting as a teenager, it was like Bart and the bow were made for each other. From that point on, he never hunted with a rifle. But more importantly, after getting his master's degree from Montana State University in wildlife biology, he went to Yellowstone to work on the grizzly bear recovery project. The goal of this project was to study the reactions of grizzlies to human encroachment. His role in the study, as you might guess, was as the human doing the encroaching. During this, he would spend months in Yellowstone getting as close to grizzlies as he could, and he did it without getting a single scratch. So considering his training, skills, and experience in the wild, it's understandable why Bart's family and friends refused to believe that he was simply the victim of a bear attack. And to them, another similar incident was proof that it couldn't have been. In October of 2003, the remains of Timothy Treadwell and Amy Hunard were found in Alaska being guarded by a large grizzly bear. Disturbingly, the couple had a camera running while they were attacked and it recorded for 8 gruesome minutes before running out of tape. Bart's family pointed to the scuffle that ensued after they were attacked as reason to believe that what happened to him was different. Brown bear attacks as a whole are rare despite the reputation grizzlies have for being aggressive. This might not be true for polar bears, but black and brown bears want little to do with humans. In fact, brown bears will often change their behaviors over time to avoid humans entirely. The most common scenario that triggers a brown bear attack is running into a female and her cubs, but even then, the attack is defensive. And although they can happen, predatory attacks by brown bears are even more rare. But importantly, predatory grizzly bear attacks on humans almost always have one specific feature. Grizzly bears eat everything, and that includes clothing. Anything they can't finish all at once, they'll hide and then stay near till finished. Afterward, evidence of a human victim is obvious since an attack scene will be surrounded by bear scat containing shredded pieces of clothing. And the scene of Timothy and Amy's attack was consistent with all this behavior. When rangers came upon the wrecked campsite, they were immediately charged by a large bear, keeping watch over the remains. The bear was then killed and open on site, and inside its stomach were the remains of Timothy and Amy. Then around the campsite were piles of scat with shredded clothing in them. The scene of Bart's campsite was very different. There were no clear signs of a struggle found at the campsite or in the area where his boat and remains were found. It was also clear that there was no attempt to bury or conceal the remains, and an examination of the bones showed no signs of scratches or gouges usually seen in bear attack victims. Bear attacks are also messy, yet the only blood found among Bart's belongings was this spot on his face mask. The camouflage pants at the scene were also whole and undamaged, which almost certainly wouldn't have been the case if he was wearing them during an attack. There was also no bear guarding his remains when they were found, and most notably, none of the bear scat near his remains or anywhere else in the area had the slightest trace of clothing in it. Even the bins full of food supplies found at Bart's campsite were completely untouched, which is not common. To Bart's friends and family, with his background and experience with bears combined with the physical evidence found at Reed Lakes, something just seemed off. During his time in Yellowstone, he escaped close calls with grizzlies on several occasions. He knew what to do if he encountered a bear, and he knew what to do in the event of an attack. In addition, since predatory bear attacks aren't over quickly, his family is convinced that if a bear had managed to pin him down for any length of time, there would have been more signs of a struggle. But despite his family's protests, the RCMP hasn't budged on its conclusion that Bart was eaten by a bear. As with many of these cases, people have put forth theories to explain what happened. Some people think he may have had some sort of medical issue like a heart attack or an aneurysm. This might explain why there were no signs of a struggle. He might have died of a heart attack and then was consumed afterward. However, on the other hand, some people think there is a more sinister explanation. Some people think Bart may have encountered someone else in the woods shortly after arriving, and that's the real reason for all of the inconsistencies. In any case, after almost 20 years, it's not clear exactly what happened to Bart in the Yukon, and strangely, despite maintaining that all evidence points to a bear attack, the RCMP still considers Bart's case open and unsolved. Because some of the names in the next story have not been released to the public, pseudonyms have been assigned to some of the people in it. Any potential resemblance to their actual names is purely coincidental. In any case, on September 5th, 2014, Aaron Hedges met up with 2 of his hunting buddies near the Cottonwood Lake Trail in Montana. This was just a short drive from where he lived in the city of Bozeman. The three men were about to begin an elk hunting trip in an area called the Crazy Mountains. This range covers about 600 square miles in central Montana, and legends tell of a woman who went insane after her family was killed during their travel westward. And apparently, she went on to live for years in these remote mountains afterward. In any case, this was a favorite spot of the three men, and Aaron made similar trips at least 4 or 5 times a year. In fact, he went up there so often, he had a permanent cache of supplies at a cabin near another lake known as Sunlight Lake. When Aaron got to the trailhead and got out of his car, his friends, who we'll call Keith and Brandon, immediately noticed Aaron's demeanor was off. He seemed agitated and confrontational, so Keith and Brandon just did their best to stay out of his way until he got it all out of his system. The first 2 days of their trip were largely uneventful until a spooked deer tossed Aaron's sleeping bag down a slope too steep and rocky to attempt a retrieval. So after spending their second night near a lake known as Campfire Lake, Aaron told the other 2 men he was going to head to his supplies at Sunlight Lake. As the crow flies, the lake was less than 2 miles from where they were. Unfortunately, there was no direct trail between the two, so instead he'd need to head down one trail and then back up another. This meant he'd have to travel more like 6 miles than 2 because the route was so indirect, but either way it was better than not having a sleeping bag. So he set off at 7:30 a.m. that morning, and the plan was that once he grabbed what he needed there, he would just backtrack to their campsite. Later that day, around 4:30, Keith and Brandon radioed Aaron to let him know that they shot an elk and they'd need to track it, so it might be a bit of time before they got back to the campsite. In response, Aaron didn't even acknowledge the news about the elk and radioed back that he had missed the turnoff for the second trail. Based on where they thought he was, Keith and Brandon just told him to turn around and head back to camp instead and they'd figure something else out. But Aaron didn't reply, and this was the last exchange either man had with him. 3 days later, on September 10th, the phone rang at Aaron's house. His wife Christine picked up and heard Keith's voice on the other end. Skipping over the normal small talk, Keith just asked Christine if Aaron was still alive. This question obviously both horrified and confused her. She hadn't seen Aaron since he left to meet up with them, and because cell phone service was spotty in the mountains, she hadn't heard from him since then either. After asking him to clarify what he meant, Keith explained that he and Brandon were back from the hunting trip, but Aaron had disappeared a few days prior and that she might want to call search and rescue. After quickly ending their phone call, Christine called the police, and by 11 o'clock, the first searchers were showing up in the mountains. Unfortunately, the timing of being reported missing couldn't have been worse. A freak snowstorm rolled into the area that night, which is pretty unusual for September, even in the mountains. Searchers on foot were quickly turned back, and so 2 horse teams were sent out after that, but they didn't make it much further either. So, the search for Aaron would have to wait until the storm cleared. In the meantime, Keith and Brandon were contacted by the police and asked to come to the police station. Over the next few days, investigators would interview the 2 men several times, with Keith being the more forthcoming of the 2. Brandon offered some information, but was seen as sort of uncooperative. The phone call to Christine that night and the amount of time between when they were last in contact with Aaron and when he was reported missing also immediately raised eyebrows. Then, in addition to that, Brandon's standoffishness only raised more suspicions. During these interviews, each of the men was asked by the investigators to make their best guess about what happened to Aaron, and both of them would say that he probably never made it to the cabin and was probably dead. After being pressed on why they came to that conclusion, Keith told investigators that Aaron wasn't in the right state of mind the whole trip. On top of that, both of them would say that he didn't have the equipment to deal with the weather that came through a few days earlier. Weirdly as well, in all of their conversations with police in the days following Aaron's disappearance, neither of them mentioned anything about searching for him. The following day, on September 11th, the search for Aaron finally began, and then for almost a week, 59 searchers on foot, 20 dog teams, 7 horse teams, and helicopters equipped with night vision and spotlights combed the area and found nothing. The 2 feet of snow that had just fallen didn't help either and obscured any evidence that could point to where he was. During this time, police were stationed at trailheads and junctions just in case Aaron wandered through, but even more weirdly, the only people they saw were Keith and Brandon. Supposedly, the 2 of them said they came out to the area to help with the search, but they were told to stay out of it. They then went to another police officer and suggested the idea of going to Sunlight Lake cabin to search. Again, they were advised not to, but this time they didn't listen. The 2 of them then walked through the snow all the way to Sunlight Lake to search for themselves. Why the police never went to the cabin to search is unclear, but either way, they spent the night at the cabin and then returned home for more interviews with the police. During the next round of interviews, they told investigators about their search and that they didn't see anything to indicate Aaron even made it to the cabin. And as police continued to interview friends and family, the more it became apparent that something Keith had mentioned in their first interview was more important than they initially realized. When Keith had mentioned that Aaron wasn't in his right mind, he told police that Aaron was in the midst of a serious alcohol problem and it was creating a lot of problems at home. Police then followed up with Christine and she confirmed it and that he was recently prescribed a medication that was supposed to reduce his cravings. Every day leading up to the hunting trip, she even begged him not to go because the medication made him unstable on his feet. Later, Aaron's brother would also tell police that a handful of friends and family severed ties with Aaron because of his drinking. Basically, it seemed like leading up to the trip, Aaron was spiraling, and his brother had been concerned that he might do something drastic. About a week after the storm, the snow had mostly melted and search and rescue finally made its first discovery. Aaron's boots were found a few miles from the junction for Sunlight Lake, and near the boots, searchers also discovered a water bottle and 2 campfires that had been put out recently. The search continued for 4 more days in and around that area, but nothing else was found. Then, unfortunately, on September 22nd, the sheriff's office announced that it was scaling back the search and rescue due to a lack of evidence and the hazards in the area that threatened searcher safety. After that, months went by without much of anything until Brandon met with investigators in early March of 2015. This time, he was much more candid with police about Aaron and what went on in the Crazies several months earlier. Brandon would say that Aaron's usual drinking pattern included at least a pint of whiskey every day, which put into perspective just how much of a problem it was. Apparently, even when Aaron got to the trailhead, he already smelled of alcohol, leading Brandon to believe that he drank on the way there. He also brought some alcohol with him for the trip, but not nearly enough to keep up his pint-a-day whiskey habit for a 5 to 7 day trip. But either way, when Aaron arrived, he was in terrible shape. When they arrived at Campfire Lake the next day, Brandon watched Aaron struggle to sight his bow to the point where he was shooting rocks and blowing up his arrows, something which was ordinarily no problem for him. This more detailed account that they were getting from Brandon seemed to flesh out more of the story for police. And to this point, Keith and Brandon weren't considered suspects since police saw no evidence that foul play was involved. Brandon was also now being cooperative, and multiple sources were indicating that Aaron had a considerable alcohol problem that could have been related to his disappearance. The 2 men's stories also matched, but at the same time they appeared deceptive at times and anxious at others. Because of this, police thought that getting a hold of each of their cell phones might provide enough useful information to either corroborate what they were saying or reveal it to be untruthful. Unfortunately, neither of them willingly handed over their phones for police to search, but Keith did allow investigators to review his GPS device and read a single text he received from Aaron. On the GPS device, everything looked like it lined up with their story until investigators noticed that there were no waypoints. A waypoint is used to determine location, distance, and heading. This was odd because there was a lot of private property in the mountains where they were, which is illegal to hunt on. GPS waypoints would have helped to ensure the men stayed in the right areas and didn't accidentally go into private property. But even more weird than the lack of waypoints was the text message. The message from Aaron was that he'd call Keith later that night, and the phone showed that the message was received at 8:35 p.m. on the night of September 9th, 2 days after Keith and Brandon initially claimed to have last heard from him. This information would have likely taken some of the suspicion off of them as the cause for Aaron's disappearance, so it didn't make sense why Keith wouldn't mention it. And the police finding it out after the fact only made them seem more suspicious. In any case, in June of that year, a man visiting relatives at a ranch in Sweetgrass County was riding a horse along a ridge when he spotted a bow, backpack, and some clothing. The man initially thought that a bear had gotten to someone and that he was about to find a dead body, but there was no body. He gathered it all up, and then just as he was about to head back to the ranch and call police, he saw a piece of paper on the ground. It was a hunting license with Aaron's name and photo on it. From the men's second camp to where his belongings were found was about 15 miles, but other than that stuff, nothing else was found, and that was the last of anything for quite a while. A little more than a year later, another man working on a property in the same area stumbled on skeletal remains. These were analyzed and were later confirmed to be Aaron. He was found close to the main trail and sure enough, just half a mile from his belongings found in 2015. The remains were found partially obscured from sight, but not enough to be considered hidden, and there were parts of him that were missing. This is most likely the result of animals finding his body after he was dead, because the remains showed no signs that would indicate a bear attack. Based on an analysis of his skeleton, the coroner listed his cause of death as hypothermia. This finding only made things more confusing. For starters, what happened between September 7th, when Keith and Brandon claimed to have had their last contact with Aaron, and September 10th, when they returned home from the trip without him? And why didn't either of them tell investigators that Keith had received a text message from Aaron on September 9th? Withholding that information only called into question the rest of their story. Aaron could have gotten lost, like Keith and Brandon said, but even Christine couldn't imagine a scenario where Aaron would end up lost in an area he knew so well. Brandon would later suggest that Aaron's motivations for heading to Sunlight Lake in the first place actually had nothing to do with sleeping bag and more to do with his battle against alcoholism. Brandon believed that Aaron separated from them because he knew he was about to run out and withdrawal symptoms would start to set in. Whenever that happened, Brandon believed that Aaron wanted to go through it alone, so he set off for the cabin. But maybe the medication disoriented him or withdrawal set in before he got to the cabin, and that's how he ended up lost. At the same time, if you're suspicious of Keith and Brandon, you're not alone. They displayed varying levels of cooperation with the police, and some of their stories didn't check out. Police never located the 2 campsites they had that they stayed at with Aaron on the first 2 nights of the trip, and they told investigators there was no sign of Aaron when they went to Sunlight Lake Cabin. When the police went to the cabin, however, they discovered several distinct-looking arrows with gold tips and green and white fletching. These were the same ones Aaron loved to use, but it's unclear if they were left there recently or on a previous visit. Keith and Brandon were also vague about the location of the elk they killed. To explain their caginess, some people have suggested that all 3 of the men could have been poachers. This is a theory that seems to fill in many of the holes in Keith and Brandon's story. It explains why they refused to be specific about where they harvested the elk from, because when police found the carcass, it was on private land. Poachers would have answered questions related to timelines and locations very carefully to make it look like they were hunting on public land. As you might imagine, poachers might not even be in a hurry to report a hunter as missing, and that's if Aaron was even lost in the first place. That could explain why Keith and Brandon never mentioned searching for him, because it wouldn't make sense to search for someone who isn't missing. If the 3 men agreed to separate for a while to cover more area, then only hearing from Aaron sporadically would make sense. It's uncertain if Aaron actually did miss the junction, as Keith and Brandon claim, but it is a fact that they received communication from Aaron on September 9th in the form of a text message to Keith. This could also explain why it took so long for them to let anyone know he was missing. If Aaron was alive, well, and in contact with his friends on the night of September 9th, there would have been no reason to search for him. And this is supported by the fact that the text message Keith allowed police to read was simply Aaron letting Keith know he'd call him later that night. If Aaron really was lost and off course on September 7th, you would think that the message would be panicked, urgent, or asking for help. This theory might also explain why Keith and Brandon refused to hand over their phones without a warrant. Instead of foul play, they could have simply been poachers. Their phones would have had GPS location data that would prove they were on private property. Text conversations might have even made mention of poaching too. However, despite poaching being a reasonable explanation, there are still big questions that haven't been answered. How Aaron ended up dead at all is still a mystery, and why Keith assumed that Aaron was dead already when he called Christine is even more puzzling. The text message was received a day prior to that call, and in it, Aaron seemed to be totally fine. One possible explanation for his death is his alcoholism and the effects of alcohol withdrawal. According to Brandon, Aaron wouldn't have had anything left that would prevent withdrawal from setting in. Symptoms tend to show up around 6 hours after the last drink and start out as nausea, anxiety, and headache. Within 72 hours, though, those symptoms can progress to hallucinations, dangerously high blood pressure, spikes in heart rate, and fever. If these were present when the storm came through, it's a highly plausible explanation for why Aaron didn't make it out of the crazies. All the variables could have been too much for his heart to handle. On the other hand, if Aaron did continue drinking on the trip when the storm hit, he might have been doomed anyway. Alcoholics are a segment of the population with the highest incidence of hypothermia, and the type of cold that came through on September 10th would have been more than enough to cause hypothermia. If Aaron was intoxicated during the storm, he might have just fallen asleep, completely exposed to the elements. So, what do you think happened? Do you think there's more to the story than what Keith and Brandon are letting on? Was Aaron's death an accident related to his ongoing struggle, or was there something else at play? Were the men deliberately on private property, or was that just an accident? Let me know down in the comments what you think happened. If you have a story suggestion, I'd love to hear it, and you can submit it to the form found in the description. Thanks again for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.